The mud clung to the hem of the heavy skirt, like a desperate weight, dragging with every step toward the silhouette of the cabin, vertically calicant, perched the gray mountain sky. Margaretha paused, her breath hitching as the cold rain soaked through the coarse linen of her dress, chilling the skin of her shoulders. Behind her lay the miles all of nothing but of filth and horrors, and a heart, the fodder her cowls dead in the sodden wools of her shawl. Before her stood the man, a towering mountain of his shadow against the dim lantern light of his porch, his hand resting on the frame of the door as if he were guarding the very air inside. She heard the whispers in the valley about the carpenter who lived alone, a man who worked with wood because he could not bear the complication of words. But the truth is isolation was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Ah, would you made the same choice if you were standing in her boots, faced with the freezing wilderness and only hope of a stranger who looked as though he would prefer the company wolves? Stay until the end. And please comment where you are watching from to see how far this story travels. The man stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his massive frame. He did not speak, but his gaze fell upon the small, rusted toolkit she clutched against her chest. His eyes, the color of bruised winter sky, searched hers with an intensity that made her shiver, though it had nothing to do with the biting wind. "I do not hire," he rumbled. The voice was deep, like the grinding of stones in a riverbed, lacking any warmth but carrying a strange, resonant authority. Margaretha tucked a loose strand of damp, honey-colored hair behind her ear, her round face pale but her chin held steady. She was a woman who had learned that silence was a mask for weakness, and she refused to wear it any longer. She stepped into the sliver of light spilling from the doorway. "I do not ask for hire," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I ask for an exchange. I see your roof is sagging at the north joist. If you give me a place to sleep by the fire, I will fix what you have failed to maintain." The giant man shifted, his calloused fingers tracing the grain of the doorframe. He looked at the roof, then back to the woman who stood dripping on his porch. He was a man who understood the language her intention. And he recognized the sharpness in her gaze that spoke of someone who had measured wood for a lifetime. "The roof is fine," he muttered, though the way his eyes flickered to the structural defect betrayed him. "The roof is rotting," she corrected gently, gesturing to the dark stain creeping along the rafters. "And I a better carpenter than I am a beggar." He pulled the door wider, a silent invitation that was reluctant as a winter thaw. He stepped back, allowing her to pass into the warmth of the cabin. The smell of cedar, wood smoke, and solitude hit her like a physical force. It was a space defined by hard lines and function geometry, a place where nothing was decorative and everything had a purpose. She set her satchel on rough, hewn table. Her movements were careful, methodical. She knew the weight of every tool, the specific balance of every mallet. As she began to unfasten her sodden cloak, she felt his presence bind her, an imposing wall of muscle and silence. He did not offer to take her coat, nor did he offer a chair, but he walked to the hearth and tossed a fresh log onto the embers. The sparks danced upward, illuminating the stark lines of his face, the thick, dark beard, the deep-set his brow, and the lines of weariness that seemed etched into his very skin. "Why you here?" he asked suddenly, not turning around. Margaretha paused, her hand lingering on the latch of her kit. She looked at the back of his massive shoulders, the way his flannel shirt strained against the corded muscle of his back. She had spent years running from the questions people asked. But here, in the quiet of this mountain, the truth felt less like a burden and more like a ghost she was finally ready to face. "I am here 'cause there was nowhere else that would have me," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like smoke. He turned then, his gray eyes piercing her own, searching for the crack in her composure. He did not ask if she was hungry or if she was tired. He simply gestured to the corner of the room where a pile of hides lay. "Fix the joist in the morning," he stated, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "If it holds, you may stay till the first frost." She nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Was a short-term reprieve, a fragile bridge built over an abyss of uncertainty. She lay down on the hard floor, the scent of fresh pine shavings comforting her in the darkness. But as the fire dimmed and the wind began to howl against the logs of the cabin, she found herself wondering why he had really let her in. Was he truly as cold as silence suggested? Or was he guarding a heart that had been broken in broken ways she had to understand? She closed her eyes. The rhythm of his slow, steady breathing from across the room, the only so hard in a world that had her to brag. Heart. The morning light crept through the chinks in the logs like a slow, golden liquid, illuminating the swirled dust motes in the small cabin. Margaretha woke before the sun had fully crested the jagged peaks of the mountains. Every muscle in her body ached from the journey and the damp cold of the previous night. Yet the familiar scent of cedar and spruce provided a strange, ground comfort. Across the room, Nathaniel was already awake, though he sat perfect still on a wooden bench, sharpening a broadaxe with a whetstone. The rhythmic scratch of the metal was the only sound, a steady height for a house that, as though, had how to breathe. She stood, shaking out the stiff fabric of her dress. She did not seek his attention, nor did she offer a greeting. She understood of mountain men. They were like the trees they felled, solitary and slow to allow anyone into their root systems. She walked to her satchel, withdrew a heavy iron chisel and a mallet, and moved toward the north wall. She needed to prove her worth, not with words, which he clearly held in low regard, but with the language they both spoke, the language of wood and tension. Nathaniel watched her from beneath the brim of his hat. He did not stop his work, but his hand slowed as she climbed onto a crate to reach the ceiling joist. The wood was swollen and dark with rot, a structural failure that threatened integrity of the entire western wall. She ran her fingers along the grain, feeling the damp, soft collapse of the timber. It was a tragedy of neglect, a slow decay that mirrored the stillness of this cabin. She began to work. Her movements were precise, devoid of the hesitation that often characterized the amateur. With each strike of the mallet, she found her rhythm, the vibration traveling up her arm and settling deep into her marrow. It was a release, a way to channel the grief and exhaustion of her past into something solid and destructive. Behind her, the sound of the whetstone ceased. A shadow fell across the wall as Nathaniel stood and walked over. He did not crowd her, but his presence was a massive, immovable force. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his large, caul-used hands disappearing in the fabric of his sleeves. Watched as she carved away the dead wood, exposing the healthy, underlying fiber. "You have the touch," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. It was the first time he had spoken since the night before. Margaretha did not look down. She leaned into the task, her breath hitching as she cleared a stubborn knot. "She's not lie," she replied softly. "If one listens, it tells exactly where the stress is held." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the joint. Without a word, he reached up, his hand massive and scarred, and braced the joist while she drove the new, seasoned beam into place. The contact was brief, but the warmth of his skin and the cool wood that she devoured her, that tried hard to suppress. They worked in tandem, an unspoken synchronization that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons. As the sun reached its zenith, the new beam was set. The structural integrity of the corner was restored. The groan of the roof under the weight of the mountain air ceasing. Margaretha wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of sawdust across her forehead. She looked at Nathaniel, waiting for a nod, a sign, anything that would signal she had earned her place for one more J. He inspected the work with the same cold, analytical intensity he applied to everything. He ran a thumb along the seam where the new wood met the old, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching, as if he were trying to read the lines of her character as easily as he read the grain of a tree. "There is more work," he said, his tone lacking any trace of praise. Yet there was a shift in his posture, a slight relaxing of his shoulders that told her he was satisfied. "The wood pile is low. The winters here are long and unforgiving. If you are to stay, you must understand the cost of surviving these peaks." He walked to the door, grabbing his canvas coat. He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back at her. "There is secret in the shed," he added, his voice dropping near whisper, "one that I do not share with the wind, and certainly not the valley folk. If you are to be here, you will keep your eyes forward and your questions locked away." He stepped out in the bright, harsh mountain air, leaving the door slightly ajar. Margaretha stood in the center of the cabin, the weight of his words pressing down on her. What was he protecting in that shed? Was it the source of profound, heavy silence, or a relic of a life he had been forced to leave behind? She gripped her mallet, the cold iron biting into her palm, and felt the first tremor of a deeper, more dangerous curiosity taking root. The air outside possessed a thin, biting quality that nipped at the lungs, a reminder that the mountains did not care for human comfort. Margaretha emerged from the cabin, her steps heavy as she walked toward the woodshed. She kept her head low, shielding her eyes from the glare of the sun reflecting off the granite ridges. She saw Nathaniel standing by the chopping block, his shirt discarded in favor of a heavy leather vest that highlighted the massive, corded reach of his shoulders. He moved the axe with a fluid, terrifying grace, splitting thick logs of pine as if they were nothing more than kindling. Each strike echoed against the valley walls. Keep the encroach his own strength to keep entire on Carity in wilderness at bay. She approached the woodpile, setting her own smaller hatchet aside to begin the task of stacking. As she worked, she could feel his attention shifting toward her. It was not a predatory gaze, but rather a heavy, thoughtful presence that weighed upon her shoulders. She wanted to look at him, to find some softness in the gray granite of his expression. But she remembered his warning. She kept her eyes the jagged edges of the bark, focusing on the simple, honest work of building a wall of fuel against the coming cold. "You move like a woman who has carried the world on her back," he stated, his voice cutting through the sharp mountain air. He did not stop his rhythmic labor, yet the intensity of the question forced her to pause. Margaretha looked up, her round face flushed from the exertion. She saw him wipe sweat from his brow with a forearm, his chest heaving in slow, controlled bellows. She reckoned the look in his eyes, look of man who forgotten what it was to be seen by anyone, and who was now struggling to process the presence of another soul. "Some of us had to carry more than our share," replied, her voice steady and resonant in the quiet afternoon. "It is not a choice." but a matter of necessity. He struck the log in, the wood splintering perfectly. He walked over to where she knelt, dropping a heavy armload of fuel onto the pile. The proximity of him was overwhelming. He smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and the dry, crisp scent of high-altitude air. She stood, realizing she had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. He looked down at her, his brow furrowed, his expression unreadable. "The valley folks think I am a hermit," he murmured. His voice, dropping so low, was almost lost to the wind. "They believe I hide 'cause I am ashamed. They do not understand that some things are too precious to be exposed at buzz, the judgment of small minds." Margaretha felt a pang of profound empathy. She understood the weight of being misunderstood, of being labeled by people who could not see the depth of one's own internal landscape. She reached out, intending to brush a stray sliver of wood from his sleeve. But she stopped herself, her hand trembling in the open air. "It does not matter what they believe," she whispered. "Their opinions do not heat this cabin, and they do not keep the roof over our heads." He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching the depth of her resolve. A subtle shiver, defensive wall he kept around, a slight lowering of the defensive wall he kept around him. It was a minuscule crack in his armor, but to Margaretha, it felt like an invitation. "You have a way of seeing things clearly," he admitted, his tone rough, lacking the easy cadence of casual conversation. "Most people here see only what they want to see. They see a mountain man, a stray girl, and they invent their own stories." He turned back toward the chopping block, but he did not return to his labor. He stood looking out toward the horizon, where the mountains bled in the deepening sky. The silence between them was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was thick with two lonely spirits beginning to recognize the same echo in each other. Margaretha returned to her task, her heart beating with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical labor. She realized she had stopped calculating the miles between her and the ruins of her former life. She was here, in the cold, hard reality of this man's world, and for the first time in years, she felt as if she were breathing need to apologize for her existence. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the clearing, she wondered about town that lay beyond the pass. Would they truly be so quick to judge? They see the dignity in their shared life. Or would they see only a spectacle of two broken people clinging to the edge of the world? And, more importantly, would Nathaniel ever allow the rest of the world to see him? Or was she destined to be the only witness to the man who lived behind the mountain's shadow? The storm arrived not with a warning, but with a sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. The sky turned the color of bruised slate, and the wind began to howl through the narrow mountain passes like a wounded animal. Margaretha stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching as the first fat, ice drops of rain began to pelt the earth, turning the dust into slick, treacherous mire. Behind her, the door creaked, and Nathaniel stepped out, his massive frame blocking the dim light from within. He did not say a word, but he reached past her to grab the heavy wooden shutter, his arm corded with muscle as he forced it against the rising gale. "Get inside," he commanded, the authority in his voice cutting through the rising roar of the storm. She did not argue. She stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, heavy door slamming shut behind them with finality that seemed to seal them off from the rest of the world. The room was suddenly plunged into dim, amber glow, the only light from the crackling hearth, the sound of the wind, previously a distant threat, now became a physical force, shaking the very logs of the cabin and rattling the heavy beams above. Nathaniel moved the hearth, his movements efficient and practice. He added a large, seasoned log to the fire, the sparks dancing upward like golden insects. He sat on his stool, his large, coal-used hands resting on his. He looked tired, the shadows in the room emphasizing the lines of struggle on his face. "The mountain remembers the past," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the fury of the gale. "It does not forgive easily." Margaretha sat on the edge of the hides, her knees pulled to her chest. She watched him, the flickering light casting long, dancing silhouettes against the walls. "Is that why you stay?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Because you believe you cannot be forgiven." He looked at then, his gray eyes catching the firelight. It was a gaze that pierced through her defenses, stripping away the layers of caution she had built. For the first time, he did not look away, did not retreat in the safety of his silence. "I had a life once," he began, his words slow and heavy, as if he were dragging up from the depths of a dark well. "I had a home that stood firm, and a name that meant something to the people in the valley. But when the fire came, I was not there. I was up in the high timber, chasing a dream that had no place in reality. When I returned, there was nothing left but ash and silence." Margaretha felt a sharp, sympathetic ache in her chest. She thought of her own past, the ruin of her homestead, the betrayal that had sent her fleeing into the night. She knew the weight of regret, the suffocating burden of what could have been. She leaned forward, the firelight warming her face. "We are both ghosts." "Then," she murmured, "haunted by the places we have lost, trying to find a footing in the present." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "You are not a ghost. You are here, fixing the broken things. You are building something new." "I am build it for you," she corrected, her voice barely a breath. "And in doing so, I am finally learning how to build a space for life." He stood then, his tall frame looming over the small room. He walked to the shelf and reached for a small, carved wooden box. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the intricate grain of the lid, before setting it down on the table between them. He didn't open it, but the look he gave her was one of profound, vulnerable trust, a silent invitation to share the burden of his memory. Outside, the storm intensified, the rain turning to a frantic, lashing sleet. The cabin felt like a solitary ship, tossed upon a dark and endless sea. But inside, the air was warm, and the distance between them narrowed a fragile, burning point of connection. She looked at the box, then up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was beginning to realize that the safety she sought was in the walls of the cabin, but in the trust of the man who stood before her. Yet, a shadow remained. Would this new left bind hold if the past he had bind came calling? Or was she simply a temporary shelter in a storm that would eventually break them both? The morning after the storm brought a silence so profound it felt heavy. A thick, white shroud of mist clinging to the mountain slopes. Margaretha stood on the porch, inhaling the sharp, cold scent of wet earth and pine, feeling the world had been scrubbed clean by the night's fury. She knew the time for hiding headed. The supplies were dwindling, and the cabin could not sustain people for long. The called a trip to the trading post in the valley. Nathaniel emerged, his tall form stark against the gray light. He carried a heavy burlap sack over his shoulder, his expression set in the hard, stoic lines of a man preparing for a battlefield rather than a simple errand. "You will stay close," he commanded, his voice devoid of room for argument. "The people in the town have long memories and even longer tongues." Margaretha tucks the colored hair into her braid. Gad. Her heart steadying. She understood the risk. To walk in the town with the recluse of the mountain was to invite every prying eye to cast judgment upon their arrangement. Yet, she felt a strange, protective resolve settling over her. She would let him face their derision, alone. The trek down the mountain was a descent into a world that felt alien in its noise and color. When they finally reached the edge of the small, dusty settlement, the atmosphere shifted. People stopped their work. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Conversations died the moment Nathaniel's massive, imposing figure cast a shadow over the boardwalk. Margaretha felt the weight of their scrutiny like a fizz of pressure. 1,000 visible barbs aimed at her modest, worn dress and her position at his side. They entered the trading post, the bell above the door chiming with a jarring, cheerful sound. The proprietor, a man with thin, suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger. His gaze flickered from Nathaniel to Margaretha. Not the way she stood, not behind the man, but beside him. "Well now," the proprietor sneered, his voice oily with false familiarity. "I see you have found some company. Nathaniel. A bit far from the Dutch colonies. Are we not? Girl. Or did you simply lose your way?" Margaretha felt a surge of indignation. But before she could speak, Nathaniel moved. He did not growl, nor did he raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, placing a heavy, work-hardened hand on the counter. The wood groaned under the pressure. The air in the shop turned freezing, the jovial atmosphere vanishing in an instant. "She is my assistant," Nathaniel stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded immediate silence. "And she is under my protection. Any further comment on her origin will be direct to me, not to her." The proprietor blanched, his eyes darting to the massive width of Nathaniel's chest and the cold, unyielding gray of his eyes. He quickly returned to the ledger, his hand shaking as he began to weigh the dry goods. Margaretha watched Nathaniel, a warmth blooming in her chest that she had not felt in years. He was not just protecting his solitude, he was protecting her. It was a public declaration, any vow. As they turned to leave, she noticed a figure watching them from the edge of the woods, a man cloaked in dark wool, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He did not move. He did not approach him. But his gaze remained fixed on them with a chilling, patient intensity. As they made their way back up the mount, the weight of the town's judgment felt lighter, replaced by heavy, throbbing realization of their reality. They were no longer invisible. They had drawn a line in the dust, and the world had taken note. Margaretha glanced at Nathaniel, who walked with his head high, the silhouette of his strength etched against the jagged skyline. She knew that the stranger watching them was not a coincidence. She felt a cold dread curling in her stomach. Had her past finally tracked her to this mountain? And it had. Would Nathaniel's protection shield the Kide-swather, so hard to find, so hard to leave behind? The climb back to the cabin was marked by a tense, vibrating silence. Nathaniel moved with his customary, long-legged stride, but there was a new jaggedness to his rhythm, a rigidity in his shoulders that warned Margaretha to stay silent. He was processing the encounter at the trading post, turning the insults over in his mind like sharp-edged stones. For her part, Margaretha felt the phantom weight of that watcher's gaze still clinging to her skin. The comfort of the mountain path, usually a sanctuary of pine and granite, now felt exposed, as if the forest self were watching them with the same judging eyes as the townspeople. When they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the clearing. Nathaniel dropped the supply sack onto the table with a dull thud and immediately turned to the woodpile. He did not wait for dinner, nor did he offer a word about the man in the woods. He simply began to work, his axe falling with a violence that made the air shiver. Margaretha began to untack the goods: flour, sugar, dried meat, and a small tin of coffee. Her hands moved with a familiar efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched him through the open door, the way his muscles bunched and released, the way his jaw was set like iron. He was suffering, not from the insults of the townsfolk, but from the breach of his isolation. He had let the world in, and the world had brought its ugliness to his doorstep. She stepped out onto the porch, carrying a tin cup of water. She walked toward the chopping block, stopping at a safe distance. "You do not owe them anything," she said, her voice soft, aiming to carry no further than his ears. "Their words are as empty as the wind." Nathaniel stopped. The axe head sank deep in the pine stump. He did not look at her, but he leaned heavily against the ad, his chest rising and falling in deep, ragged breaths. "They look at you, and they see a charity case," he breathed, the words heavy with a self-loathing that surprised her. "They see a mountain man who has lost his mind, living with a woman who has nowhere else to go. They make us into something small, Margaretha, and have spent so long making sure I stayed small, so that no one would notice when I finally disappeared." Margaretha felt a surge of courage. She stepped closer, ignoring the instinct that told her to retreat. "They do not see us," she said firmly. "They see a reflection of their own narrow lives. You are not small, Nathaniel. You only person who has ever looked at me and seen a human being, not a burden or a convenience." He turned then, his eyes dark and turbulent. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying hunger that made her pulse quicken. "And what you see, when you look at me, I see a man who is building a foundation," she whispered, gesturing toward the cabin, where the new, sturdy addition they had started stood as a testament to their cooperation. "I see a man who is worthy of more than this silence." His expression shifted, the anger drained away to leave a profound, aching vulnerability. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air before he forced it back down to his side. He was terrified of the connection, of the reality of having another heart beating in rhythm with his own. That night, they worked on the cabin addition by the light of a hanging lantern. The structure was finally beginning to take shape, the floorboards laid with precision, the walls rising to meet the roof. They worked in a perfect, silent symphony. He measured and lifted. She braced and nailed. It was an act of creation that felt sacred. As they drove the final beam of the day, their hands brushed, and this time, neither pulled away. The connection was electric, a bridge built of solid timber and unspoken promise. But as she lay on her bed of hides later that night, staring up the beams she had helped secure, a chilling thought took hold. If the man in the woods had followed them, he would have seen the cabin, seen the work they were doing, and seen the way Nathaniel stood as her shield. Was the mystery of Nathaniel's isolation finally coming to an end? Or was the life they were building simply a target for the ghost they both try and outrun? Man. The morning broke with a crisp, biting frost that turned the world into landscape silver and glass. Margaretha found Nathaniel already in the shed, his movements uncharacteristically frantic. He was rearranging heavy iron tools, his brow furrowed in a deep, troubled concentration that she had witnessed before. as she stepped into the dim, sawdust-scented air. She spotted a corner of the shed that, hidden behind a stack of weathered canvas tarp. There, partially obscured by shadow, sat a heavy, iron-bound chest. It was an object of such antiquity and weight that it seemed out of place among the modern function tools of the trade. Nathaniel stiffened the moment his ears caught the rustle of her dress. He spun around, his silhouette towering imposing in the cramped space. For a fleetin, the look in his eyes was not one of protection, but of profound, protective fear. "You should not be here," he said. His voice a low, warning rumble. Margaretha held her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gestured toward the chest. "I only came to find the plane. Nathaniel, I did not mean to intrude on your memories." He moved toward the chest, placing a massive hand over the lid as if to shield it from her sight. "It is not a memory," he muttered, his eyes darting to open door, as if he had banned walk in and demand an explanation. "It is a record of the life I chose to bury so that I could live in this silence." Margaretha stepped closer, her curiosity warring with her respect for his pain. "A record of what? Of who you were, or who you lost?" He hesitated, his jaw working as he wrestled with the urge to keep his walls intact. Finally, he sighed, a sound of such weariness that it seemed to rattle the very rafters of the shed. He stepped aside, leaving the chest exposed. "It is everything I have left the people who paid for my mistakes." She knelt on the dirt floor, her hands hovering over the cold, rusted lock. With a nod from him, she lifted the lid. Inside lay gold or riches, but letters, a child's wooden toy, and a stack of deeds to land that no longer existed. She picked up a small, hand-carved bird, its wings smoothed by years of small, anxious thumbs. She realized then his isolationedness, Parfire, Caplahan, guilt of survival. "You've been punishing yours for years," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the mountain peaks, visible through the open door. "I did not save them. I am not worth of the space I occupy." Margaretha stood, the toy held tight in her palm. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "If you've rough fabric of shirt, you have been keeping them alive in this dark room, but they are already gone. Do you not see that by staying here, by hiding, you are only letting the loss win?" He turned her, his eyes shimmering with a moisture he fought to suppress. It was the first time she had seen the man behind the myth, a man who was not made of granite and iron, but of sorrow and hope. "What you have me do?" he asked, his voice raw. "I would have you build," she replied, her eyes searching his. "Not just houses, but a life. I would have you be more than just a man who waits for the end." He stared at her, his breathing ragged. The air in the shed felt charged, as if the very atoms were shifting. He moved closer, his presence enveloping her, his hands slowly coming up to touch the braid at her shoulder. It was a gesture so tentative, so full of longing, that it brought tears to her eyes. "You are a dangerous woman, Margaretha," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You make me want things I have no right to possess." "We do not possess them," she answered, leaning into his touch. "We earn them." He bent his head, his forehead resting against hers. In that small, space, the weight of his past seemed to recede, replaced by the warmth of her presence. But as they stood there, anchored by each other, A sharp snap echoed from the woods, the sound a heavy branch breaking under a boot. They both froze. The moment shattering. Was it just the wind? Or had the watcher finally decided to step out of the shadows and claim what they thought they were owed? The snap of the branch hung in the air, a discordant note in the quiet morning. Nathaniel pulled away instantly, his hand dropping to his side, his posture shifting from vulnerable to predatory in a height. He moved the shed entrance with the silent, fluid grace of a mountain lion, his eyes scanning the dense line of spruce trees that bordered the clearing. Margaretha remained where she was, her heart a frantic drum, her hand still clutching the wooden bird from the chest. "Stay here," commanded, his voice a low, gravel-edged ripple. He stepped out into the clearing, his tall frame cutting a sharp, dark line against the morning light. He did not grab his axe. He relied on his own immense presence, a warning to whatever or whoever was lurking in the brush. Margaretha watched from the doorway, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw him stop at the edge of the woods, his head cocked, listening to the forest. He stood perfect still for a long, agonizing minute before he turned back toward the cabin, his brow pulled into a deep, frustrated line. He returned, his boots crunching heavily on the frost-dusted pine needles. "Nothing," he muttered, though his gray eyes remained narrowed in suspicion. "But someone was there. I can smell the tobacco, and is not a scent I carry." Margaretha stepped out to meet him, her resolve hardening. "It is the man from the town. He has been watching us." Nathaniel looked at her, his face a mask of restrained fury. "He is looking for an opening. He thinks that 'cause I live on the mountain, I have forgotten how to defend my own." "Then show him," she said, her voice steady. "Show him that we are not the broken people he imagines." That afternoon, a rider appeared on the lower trail, the same man who had been lurking at the edge of the forest. He was a local land speculator named Silas, a man with a sharp nose and a predator gait who had been trying to claim the timber rights to the northern slope for years. He rode up to the cabin with a thin, mocking smile on his face, his horse skittish in the mountain air. "Quite a setup you have here." "Nathaniel," Silas called out, his voice thin and carry over the wind. "Though it is a shame to see such prime land occupied by a hermit and a woman of questionable standing." Nathaniel moved to porch, his shadow stretching long and dark across the clearing. He did not say a word, but his presence was a wall that seemed to press the very air out of the space. Silas shifted in his saddle, his confidence fickery, the mountain cold. Calici, unyielding gaze. "You have no business on this land." "Silas," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but carry resonant authority again. "Hanop. And you have no right to speak of her." Silas sneered, but his hand tightened on the reins. "This land will be part of the expansion soon. A man like you, with his dark history, would be better off selling out and moving on. Why cling to a ruin?" Margaretha stepped out then, standing firmly beside Nathaniel. She felt the massive heat of his arm against hers, a barrier that made her feel untouchable. She looked at Silas, her eyes calm and unwavering. "This is not a ruin," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "It is a home, and we are not going anywhere." Silas glared at her, his lips curling in disgust, but he could not hold Nathaniel's gaze. With a curse, he jerked his horse around and spurred it toward the trail. He retreated, but the look he cast over his shoulder was not one of defeat. It was a look of patient, calculated malice. As he disappeared in the trees, Nathaniel remained standing there, his chest rising and falling in steady, controlled breaths. He turned to look at Margaretha, the tension in his face beginning to thaw. He reached out. Resten on the Hermar, back. That gesture, that left her breathless. He will be back, Nathaniel whispered. His voice soft, lacking the edge of anger he had held before. Let him come, she replied, leaning into him. We are together now. He stared at her, the gray of his eyes swirling with a new, dangerous emotion, a long that he could no longer hide. The threat of Silas hung in the air. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the work they had accomplished, Margaretha realized the true stakes. She was no longer protecting her life, she was protecting the only home she ever known, and the only man who had ever made her feel worthy of a future. But what would happen when the next threat was not an outsider, but the internal ghost they had buried so deeply? The season turned in a single night. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, curdled into a bruised purple, and the first true gale of the coming winter tore through the canopy with the sound of thousand rushing rivers. By dawn, the world was obscured by a swirling, blinding curtain of white. The temperature plummeted, turning the cabin's interior into a fortress of shivering wood and biting drafts. Nathaniel spent the morning the heavy shutters and dragging the last of the dry timber into the lee of the porch. His movements sluggish with the creeping, numbing cold. Margaretha worked by the hearth, her hands rhythmic as she kneaded dough for bread, the only left in the cabin. She watched him move, his massive frame hunched against the wind. When he finally stepped inside, he was coated in a thick layer of frost, his beard stiff with ice, his skin pale and taut. He'd not go the fire. He stood by the door, his eyes closed, his breathing labored. Nathaniel, she breathed, dropping the dough and moving toward him. He did not answer. He swayed, the sheer physical toll of reserves against the storm finally breaking the iron reserves of his constitution. He sank on the bench by the wall, his head dropping into his hands. His skin was freezing to the touch, and his tremors were violent, racking his powerful frame. Margaretha moved with purpose. She pushed the heavy trunk to block the draft from the door, then returned to the hearth, piling every scrap of kindling onto the embers. She grabbed the heavy woolen blankets from the bed, the thick, scratchy material smelling of cedar and earth. She wrapped them round his shoulders, but the cold had already settled in his bones. You must get warm, she murmured, her voice laced with a desperate tenderness. She knelt before him, rubbing his hands, the coarse skin of his palms feeling like sandpaper against her own. He opened his eyes, the gray color dull and unfocused. He looked at her, and for a moment, he did not seem to know where he was. The stoicism he wore like armor had been stripped away by the raw necessity of survival, leaving only the man who had lost everything. The cold, he whispered, his voice a jagged, broken sound. It is the same cold as the night house burned. It never leaves. Margaretha felt a surge of grief so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, pulling him toward the warmth of the fire. She sat on the bench, pulling his heavy, shivering form against her, wrapping the blankets tight around them both. She was not a small woman, and he was a giant. Yet in the quiet, desperate intimacy of the moment, they fit together with an agonizing, perfect geometry. She held him as he shook, her own body providing the only barrier between him and the encroaching void. She spoke to him in low, steady murmurs, words of comfort that had no history. only the immediate truth of their survival. She told him of the spring that would turn, of the way the would hold, of the life that still remained within the walls of this. Slowly, the tremors began to subside. His breathing, once jagged, smoothed in the deep, rhythmic tide of rest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his presence so heavy and absolute that she felt she could hold the entire world in place just by staying still. The storm battered the roof. The house groaned under the weight of the snow. But within the small circle of their shared heat, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the fragile, burgeoning pulse of something new. She stared in the flames, her heart heavy with a terrifying realization. She had thought she was the one being saved, the one who had found a harbor in his strength. But as she felt his steady, warm breath against her skin, she understood that the balance had shifted. He was much a survivor as she was, and they were anchored by nothing more than the thin, desperate thread of their own endurance. If the storm outside grew even fiercer, or if the isolation finally fractured the pits they had built, could they truly survive the weight of what they had begun to feel for one another? The fever lingered for 2 days, a haze of delirium that kept Nathaniel tethered to the blurred boundary between the living and the ghosts of his past. Margaretha remained at his side, a constant, grounding presence in the suffocating heat of recovery. She kept the fire burning, the rhythmic pop and hiss of the logs acting as the only clock in a cabin lost to the winter abyss. She watched hiss with cool, dampened cloths, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle grace that she had learned through years of quiet service. His eyes often wandered, focus on shadows that did not exist. His voice a gravelly murmur as he apologized she did not know. To a wife, a child, to the life he had failed to protect. Each word was a jagged glass shard of his history, and she listened to everyone, absorbing the weight of grief until her own heart ached with the burden it. She did not shrink away. She held his hand, the massive fingers limp and pale, and, with stories of the mountain, the coming spring, of the way the cedar would smell when the snow finally melted. On the third morning, the fever broke. Nathaniel stirred. His heavy eyelids fluttered, fanned the focus to look at her. By the delirium had vanished, replaced by a clarity that was almost more piercing than his previous silence. He looked at the room, at the heavy blankets, and finally at Margaretha, who sat slumped in the chair, her head resting against his cot, exhausted beyond measure. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice thin but steady. Margaretha sat up, her joints stiff, her hair loose and tangled. She offered him a weak, tired smile. "There was no else I would rather have been." He shifted, the movement clumsy and weak, as he reached out to touch her hand. His skin was warm now, the chill of past, dream having passed. He looked at her with intensity that made her breath catch. "I saw them," he admitted, his gaze drifting to the corner where the shadow of the chest still lingered. "I saw them as they were. But I also saw you. You were the only thing that kept me from following them in the dark." Margaretha felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She realized that the barrier he had spent years maintaining, the one between his present and his past, had been completely dismantled by the illness. He was no longer hiding behind the silence. He was looking at her, seeing her for the first time with the lens of his own self-imposed exile. "You chose to stay," she said, her voice soft. "That is a beginning, Nathaniel." He squeezed her hand, a flicker of something like hope lighting his gray eyes. "It is a heavy thing, To begin again when you have spent so long waiting for the end. We do not have to carry it alone, she replied. As the day wore on, he began the slow, grueling process of regaining his strength. He sat up, leaning against the logs of the wall, his presence once again filling the small room, even in his weakened state. They spoke then, not of the past, but of the cabin, of the small fixes still needed, of the way the wood reacted to the extreme cold. It was a conversation of mundane things. Yet every sense felt like a brick in a new foundation. But the peace was fleeting in them. A heavy, insistent tugging against the front door jolted them both. Nathaniel stiffened. His hand instinctively moved the iron poker by the hearth. The messenger from the town, a boy no older than 16, stood outside, his face frantic, clutching a water-damaged envelope. The message was not from Silas, but from the authorities in the valley. It was a notice of inquiry of a woman from the Eastern Territory, a woman with a description that matched Margaret's hair, down to the exact shade of her and the hands. Nathaniel looked at the paper, then back at her, the mask of the stoic protector fallen away to reveal a cold, hollow dread. Had her history finally clawed its way up the mountain? And was the man he was becoming strong enough to fight the law to keep her? The envelope fell from Nathaniel's hand, the heavy paper fluttering to the floor boards like a wounded bird. Margaretha stood frozen, the warmth of the cabin feeling suddenly suffocating, the air thick with the metallic tang of impending ruin. She did not need to read the words. She saw the reflection of her own terror in Nathaniel's eyes. The valley was not just looking for a lost soul. They were looking for witness to a crime she had never committed but could never prove she had avoided. The law did not care for the truth of her quiet life. It only cared for the closure of a ledger. Nathaniel stood, his movements stiff and agonizing. Yet he moved with a singular, protective focus. He walked to the door, checking the iron bolt, his silhouette blocking the gray, swirling light of the blizzard. When he turned to face her, the transformation was complete. The vulnerability that had defined his recovery was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that chilled her the marrow. They will be coming, he stated, his voice a flat, dead sound. The storm will slow them. But the law does not tire. Margaretha felt the world tilting. She thought of the cabin, of the sturdy beams they had secured, of the way shavings Nanad. She had been a ghost for so long that she had forgotten how it felt to have something worth fighting for. You must send me away, she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. If they find me here, they will take everything from you. They will burn the work, and they will call you a criminal for shielding me. Nathaniel crossed the room in 2 long strides, his presence so massive and absolute that it seemed to anchor the entire structure against the howling wind. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm, grounding, and undeniably possessive. I believed I was not worth the trouble of fight. One hat, he growled, his voice rising in intensity. But I will not hide now. I will not let them write the ending to our story. They will break you, she sobbed, the dam of her composure finally shattering. I have already been broken, he countered, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks, his touch as rough as bark yet as gentle as a lullaby. They cannot break what is already in pieces, but they can try to take you, and that is where the mountain and I will reach our limit. He turned back to Gear in the corner, pulling on his heavy, snow-crusted coat. He began to organize the supplies, his movements precise and lethal. He was preparing for a siege. not of wood and stone, but of iron and will. He looked at her, his gray eyes burning with a terrifying, beautiful ferocity. "You will stay in the root cellar," he commanded, his tone admitting no protest. "If they come, you are not here. You are a memory, a ghost of the storm. Do you understand?" Margaretha nodded, though her heart was screaming in defiance. She realized that the sacrifice he was prepared to make was the ultimate act of love, a total, reckless abandonment of his own safety to ensure hers. She felt a profound, aching pride in him, a feeling that eclipsed her fear. She went to him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, power thrum of his heart beneath the heavy flannel. "Do not let them destroy you, Nathaniel," she murmured, her forehead pressed against his. "They will have to climb the mountain to reach me," he replied, his voice a low, resonant promise. As he stepped toward the door, he paused, looking at the carved wooden bird she still held. He reached down, his hand lingering on her braid, a silent, desperate prayer for a future they had barely dared to imagine. He walked out in the biting, white chaos, the door latching with a heavy, final click that echoed through the empty room. Margaretha stood alone in the silence, the weight of the coming confrontation pressing against the walls. Wondered if the foundations they had built were true against weight of the entire world. Kaori. The darkness of the root cellar was absolute. A heavy, earthen silence that pressed against Margaretha's skin like water. Above, the house was a muffled shell, the wind screaming over the roof in a frantic, disjointed rhythm. Every time a board groaned or a heavy step sounded on the floorboards, her breath snagged in her chest. She crouched in the damp corner, her knees tucked against her chin, listened to the muffled, low rumble voice filtering down through the floorboards. Nathaniel was not alone. The law had arrived. Their presence, a cold, foreign friction in the sanctuary of his home. She heard the sharp, the authoritative bark of a man's voice, the sheriff from the valley, his tone clipped and hungry. Then came the response, a sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the very earth she sat upon. Nathaniel's voice. It was not the voice of a man in hiding, nor the voice of a man who was afraid. It's the voice of the mountain itself, imposing, immovable, and dangerous. "You have no warrant for a private dwelling, Sheriff," Nathaniel said, the word smooth and deliberate, "and you have no proof of any crime. You are trespassing on a man who has no patience for interference. We are investigating a missing woman." "Nathaniel," the sheriff snapped, "we have reports she was seen heading toward the high timber. You have been living here in total isolation for years. It is common knowledge you have a history keeping to yours when you have something hide." Nathaniel replied, and his voice dropping into that terrifying, quiet register that Margaretha had come to associate with absolute protection. "I have built a life here. If you wish to search my home, you will do it over my objection, and you will understand that you are inviting a level of complication you were not prepared to handle." Margaretha pressed her hands over her ears, the tension so acute it felt as if her heart might rupture. She realized then that he was doing exactly what she had feared. He was putting his life, his reputation, and his existence on the line. He was standing as an immovable wall between her and the machinery of a world that refused to let them be. She felt a surge of hot, searing rage at her own helplessness. She had spent a lifetime being pushed by circumstance. And now, when both her life odds threatened, she was reduced to a ghost in the cellar. She shifted, her hand brushing against loose stone in the foundation. It moved. Her heart leaped. Careful, silent motions. She pried the stone from the wall, revealing a narrow gap that looked out on the porch. Through the sliver of space, she saw them. 3 men stood on the porch, their horses steaming in the freezing air, their breath plumes of white vapor. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking any view into the interior. He looked like a titan of the old world, his beard thick with ice, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding light. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Do not be a fool, man. Stand aside." Nathaniel did not move. He did not even blink. "The threshold of this cabin is not for you to cross." The impasse was absolute. Margaretha watched, paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying power of the man she'd come to love. She realized that he was not just defending a woman. He was defending the person he had become because of her. He was defending the dignity of their shared work, the sanctity of the home they had constructed, and the very idea that a broken man could be redeemed by the presence of another. A flicker of doubt crossed the sheriff's face as he looked up at the towering, calm, an utter unafraid man before him. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who understood when he was outmatched by something larger than his own authority. He hesitated, his eyes darting to cabin's sturdy, newly finished edition, the work of souls who had refused to give up. "We will be back with the proper papers," the sheriff spat, his voice losing its edge. "And if you are hiding her, Nathaniel, you will face the full weight of the territory. I will be here." As the riders turned and disappeared in the white shroud of the storm, the silence that returned to the cabin was different. It was the silence of a battle won, but a war only just beginning. Nathaniel stood in doorway for a long time, watching them vanish. Then he turned and walked toward the trap door. Margaretha held her breath. The darkness of the feeling suddenly, overwhelmingly bright with the promise of his return. But as he lifted the heavy wood, the expression on his face was not one of triumph. It was the expression of a man who never stepped back. Evergain stepped back from. Nathaniel lowered the lantern into the cellar, the golden light washing over Margaretha's pale, upturned face. He did not speak immediately. He reached down, his massive hand spanning the opening, and pulled her up with a strength that felt like a salvation. When her feet touched the floorboards, he did not release her. He pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapped around her with a fierce, crushing intensity that forced the breath from her lungs. He was shaking not from the cold, but from the raw, tectonic shift of the confrontation. "They are gone," he breathed into her hair. His voice vibrated against her skin. "They are gone. And you are still here." Margaretha clung to him, her fingers digging into the heavy canvas of his coat. She could feel the rapid, irregular pounding of his heart, a frantic drumbeat that mirrored the chaos in her own mind. She looked up, searching his face, looking for the man who had faced the law, his own unshakable resolve. He looked exhausted, his gray eyes shadowed by the immense weight what he had risked. Yet there was a new clarity in his expression. "You should not have done it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You risked everything for me." "I risked nothing," he countered, his hand sliding to her face, his thumbs gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I have spent years living in a world of ghosts. You are the only thing that is real. If I lose you, I lose the only reason I have to stand at all." They moved to the table, the place where they spent so many hours in silence. now a monument to the life they had fought to keep. The structure of the cabin felt different tonight. It felt like an extension of them. The addition they had built, the room they had labored over, the beams they had secured, stood as a silent witness to their defiance. It was a foundation not just timber and iron, but of trust and shared resilience. "The sheriff will return," she said, her voice turning firm. "He will have the papers, and he will not be so easily deterred the next time." "Then let him return," Nathaniel replied. He walked to the corner, retrieving a set of heavy, iron-bound ledgers and a map of the territory he had kept tucked away for years. He laid them out on the table, the flickering light casting long shadows over the documents. "I have lived on land for a decade. I have paid the taxes. I have improved the structure, and I have never once been a shadow on the face of the law. There are legal ways to claim protection, and there are ways to ensure that no man commanded reason. I have been a fool to hide. I should have stood my ground years ago." He looked at her, his expression softening into a look of profound, aching adoration. "You taught me that, Margaretha. You taught me that hiding is the same as dying." She reached out, tracing the map, her finger lingering over the boundaries of the mountain acreage. She felt a surge of strength that was entirely new. She was no longer a runaway, no longer an underdog looking for a corner to hide in. She was a woman who had built a house, a life, and a heart with the man who stood beside her. "What's the core loop?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting his. "What is the secret had kept you bound to this mountain for so long?" Nathaniel paused, his gaze drifting toward the heavy, iron-bound chest in the corner, the repository of his past. He reached out and took her hand, his palm warm and call-used. "The secret is not the fire," he murmured, his voice finally shedding the last of its defensive weight. "The secret is that I stayed because I believed of my buys the one who could keep their memory alive by suffering. I believed that if I ever let go of the guilt, I would truly lose them. But today, when I stood at that door, I realized that keeping them alive means living a life worth their sacrifice. It means building. It means protecting. It means loving you." The revelation hung in the air, a profound catharsis that seemed to settle the very dust in the room. He was finally free. The guilt that had been his anchor was now the wind at his back. But even as the weight lifted, a lingering fear remained. The sheriff would return with the law on his side, and the struggle to protect what they had built was only about to reach peak. They had the foundation, but could they pressure of the storm? Ole was surely coming. The days following the sheriff's departure were marked by a frantic, purposeful energy. Nathaniel would fur the law to. He moved with the precision of a man who had finally mapped his own destiny. He spent the daylight hours fortifying the cabin's perimeter, not with weapons, but with the legal documentation of his land rights, filing the necessary paperwork through a series of intermediaries he had long ignored. Margaretha worked alongside him, her hands steady as she helped him organize the history of his decade-long residency. They were no longer two people in hiding. They were a man and a woman securing their future. Yet, the atmosphere remained heavy with the approaching confrontation. The blizzard had subsided, leaving the world encased in a blinding, crystalline silence. Then, on the fourth morning, the riders again. This time, there were more of them, and at the front rode the sheriff, accompanied by a stern-faced magistrate holding a folded document. Nathaniel stepped on the porch, shaven, his hair tied back, and he wore his best wool coat. He did not look like the recluse they had labeled a madman. He like a man who owned the very ground he stood upon. Margaretha stood just behind him, her chin held high, her presence a silent, powerful assertion of her right to exist in the light of day. "We have the warrant," the sheriff announced, his voice lacking its previous bluster. He looked at Nathaniel, and, for the first time, he seemed to realize he was addressing a peer, not a pariah. Nathaniel did move to block the way. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior of the cabin. "Search as you must, Sheriff, but you will find no fugitive here. You will find a citizen, a homeowner, and a woman who is under the protection of the law and the man who stands as her witness." The magistrate stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the room, lingering on the structural integrity of the addition, the orderly arrangement of the tools, and the peaceful, domestic warmth that radiated from the hearth. He looked at Margaretha, noting the calm strength in her expression, the dignity of her bearing, and the undeniable stability of their life together. The search was brief and clinical. When they returned to the porch, the magistrate held the warrant, his gaze fixed on the mountain peaks. "There has been a mistake," he said, his voice clipped but respectful. "The woman we are looking for does not reside at this location. It appears our information was outdated." The sheriff hesitated, his gaze flickering between Nathaniel and Margaretha. He knew the truth, or he suspected it. But the man before him, the hermit who could be easily bullied. He was a force of stability, a pillar of the terrorist structure. The sheriff tucked the warrant away, his face turned a shade of frustrated gray. "You have been lucky, Nathaniel." "I have been hard-working," Nathaniel corrected, his voice steady as the foundation they had built. As they rode away, the silence of the mountain rushed back in, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of victory. Nathaniel turned to Margaretha, his gray eyes shining with emotion that transcended words. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his skin warm and pulsing with life. "They did not see a fugitive," he whispered. "They saw us. They saw what we built," she replied, her eyes searching his. The core loop, the burden of his guilt and the prison of his isolation was finally, irrevocably broken. He had protected her, not by hiding, but by claiming his right to a life, to a home, and to her. They stood together on the porch, the vast, cold expanse of the mountains stretching out before them. But for the first time, the wilderness did not feel like a threat. It felt like a kingdom they had earned. Yet, as the sun began to set, a long, golden path toward the valley, Margaretha felt the lingering sting of the journey. They had survived. But what cost to the ghost they had left behind? Would the peace they had found be enough to hold them as seasons turned? Or was there still one final, internal mountain left to climb? The spring thaw arrived with a gentle, persistent warmth softened the jagged edge of the mountain and turned froze-eyed seawing and brooks. The air was filled with the scent of pine needles and damp, awakening earth in the clearing. The cabin stood strong, its new additions seamlessly integrated into the original structure, a testament to the hands that had labored to hold it together. Margaretha stood on the porch, her hand resting on the smooth, polished wood the railing she had finished sanding just the day before. Her round face glowed with a quiet, inner light, and the sadness that had once haunted her eyes had been replaced by a deep, settled peace. Nathaniel emerged from the woodshed, his massive shoulders moving with a fluid, easy grace. He carried a bundle of fresh branches. his thick hair caught back in a simple tie. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his gray eyes searching hers. There was no longer any shadow of het in his gaze, no lingering flicker of the man who had sought to bury him in the dark. He had emerged, just as the mountain emerged from the winter, and he looked at her with an openness that still made her pulse quicken. He set the cedar down and stepped up onto the porch, his presence once again a grounding and absolute. He did not say a word, but the way he stood, the way he reached out to tuck a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, told the story of a journey pleaded. They had navigated the storms of the law, the crushing weight of their own pasts, and the biting cold of their own securities, and they had come out on the other side. "The wood is ready," he murmured, his voice a rich, steady vibration. "The structure is solid. It will hold against any wind." Margaretha looked at him, feeling the profound, cathartic weight of their survival. She had come to him as an underdog, a woman fleeing the ruins of a life that had failed her, and he had been a giant lost in the echo of his own regret. Together, they had built more than a house. They had built a sanctuary, and they had learned that healing was not absence of scars, but the courage to continue in spite of them. "We have done well, Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice filled with a lifetime of gratitude. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "We have done more than well, Margaretha. We have come home." They stood there for a long time, held by the silence of the mountain and the promise of coming Sarnas, the threat of the valley, the sting of the townspeople's judgment, and the ghost that had once haunted thee. Shed all had faded in the background, rendered insignificant by the reality of the life Nasre had crafted. That no man is a mountain unto all, all, and no woman is a burden that cannot be carried by a loving heart. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting a warm, amber glow across the clearing, Nathaniel took her hand and led her inside. The fire was already crackling, the interior of the cabin warm and welcoming. It was a space defined not by function or isolation, but by the shared, resilient joy of two people had finally earned the right to belong. The story of the carpenter and his assistant would eventually become a legend in the valley, a quiet, campfire memory passed down through the years. People would speak of the giant man who found his voice, and the woman who taught him that even the hardest timber could be shaped into heart. But here, in the quiet reality of their evening, there were no legends. There was only the steady, rhythmic beat of their hearts in unison, the warmth of the hearth, and the profound, certain knowledge that they face whatever the next brought, as they had faced the last. Together, the foundation was set. The walls were secure, and for the first time in their lives, they were finally, truly, whole. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This content is intended for entertainment purpose as only and promotes whole values such as healing, resilience, and emotional growth.